So Nintendo has finally announced the Ocarina of Time remake, a game that many fans have been essentially clamoring for a long time now, since remakes have been a really big thing in the last 10 or so years. Now, I know there's a huge part of the fandom that does not want Ocarina of Time to be remade, simply for a couple of reasons. One of them being, hey, the game is perfect, the game is still playable, there's no reason to remake it. And I do think there is some case of, yes, I agree with you. Because as a fan and it being one of my favorite games of all time, I do think that the game is still perfect. However, I'm also someone who understands and is kind of a realistic person. And while the game is still playable, the game is still a lot of fun, and I play that game once every year, the game can be a little rough around the edges in some places. And a lot of the times, a lot of modern gamers just don't want to deal with that stuff. You know, they don't want to deal with some of the clanky controls. Granted, they did do a remaster. I know a lot of people say it's a remake, but to me, it's more of a remaster for the Nintendo 3DS. A couple of years ago, I think it's like 15 years ago. So it's not even a couple. It's like 15 years ago now. And yes, you could play that if you have a 3DS, but most people don't. And I do think that a remake of Ocarina of Time is necessary, especially for people who want to experience why we love that game so much, why we love that game, why it's our favorite game, why so many people consider it the greatest game of all time, to the point that it influenced so many games that people love today, such as Grand Theft Auto. It literally inspired Grand Theft Auto, according to the creator of Grand Theft Auto, who said, hey, if you are a gamer, if you develop games and you have never once took any inspiration from Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, you're basically lying. And that's him saying that yes, GTA was inspired by a lot of things that Ocarina of Time did back in 1998. And it's true. A lot of people will consider Ocarina of Time as the groundbreaking game that not only paved the way into 3D gaming, but also open world gaming. I know a lot of people will probably point to it being similar to, I would say, the original Elder Scrolls, where the expansive open world of the original Elder Scrolls really is what inspired so many open world games today. But it wasn't until Ocarina of Time that really blew people's minds and made people realize, oh, this is actually possible. It's actually possible to make a gigantic open world game where you're able to traverse to any place in the world and in real time have everything load, so that there's no loading screens, there's no cutscenes or anything like that that prevent you from entering this vast open world. And back then, Ocarina of Time really was the groundbreaking game that started it, really, because the moment you leave the Lost Woods and enter the open world of Hyrule, yes, there are certain sections that you have to go to visit the next section. But the vast open Hyrule field was so massive, so amazing, that it really felt like, oh my god, this is where gaming is now. We are able to explore such a vast world and do whatever we want. Now gaming has gotten to the point where, like, you know, what Ocarina of Time did is just like really small compared to what we have with Skyrim, with the new Legend of Zeldas, you know, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But back then, it was a groundbreaking achievement. And so many people love this game to death. So many consider this game their favorite game of all time, myself included. I think it is the greatest game of all time because I love everything about it, from the story, from the gameplay, from the characters. Everything was just so well paced. Everything just fits so nicely into a game that really left such a mark on you, especially if you were young and playing it for the first time. So, while I do agree in certain cases that Ocarina of Time does not need a remake, I do think it should. I think it's one of the games that deserves a remake, especially to give to modern gamers who probably would not play the original Ocarina of Time because they may even not be interested. Because I can also kind of feel that way because of the way 3D gaming is nowadays. It's a little hard for me to go back to the side scrollers, to go back to the original Legend of Zelda and play that game without wanting essentially the 3D controls, because those old games, there was lag inputs beyond belief, and it frustrates me, especially when I play old games like Mega Man. But there was just something about that era that really, really captivated us. And I think that's what remakes are for, to help captivate us as gamers, especially for newer gamers. You want newer gamers to understand why we old heads love those video games, why we loved Ocarina of Time. So that's why I think a remake is perfect. I think it's about time for a remake of Ocarina of Time. That's what I truly believe. Now here comes the question that I want to talk about in this video, and that is, will there be changes? Will there be additions, subtractions? Maybe it might be a completely different game from the original. Nintendo has probably done, I want to say around, I want to give a round number, maybe like 4 remakes in the last 10 years, one of them being Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. And for the most part, from the remakes they have done, they haven't done like anything too egregious to the point where it's like a completely different game. Because remakes have been just spawning out like crazy over the last 10 years. Resident Evil 2 Remake, I think, started that trend a little bit. And because of Resident Evil 2 Remake, there has been some who love the game, and I think a lot of modern gamers think of it as one of the best Resident Evil games of all time. It's actually my personal favorite Resident Evil game of all time. But a lot of old heads also don't like Resident Evil 2 Remake because it cuts off a lot of content. The side A and the side B scenarios are just, they don't fit really well enough compared to how the OG did it. And granted, it comes from the fact that Capcom never initially wanted to do a side A and a side B. They just wanted to do one full playthrough, one full story with no side A and side B. So they had to essentially kind of like, rush a side B scenario. And there's just certain parts of it that just don't mesh together well in continuity. So I can understand why a lot of old head Resident Evil fans don't like it, aside from also not it being 10 controls and whatever other reason they may have. Then you have a remake like Final Fantasy VII, where for the most part, a lot of the story beats from the original game still exist in it. But there are additions, subtractions, and changes to the point where some even believe that this is a sequel. And that's what a lot of fans are really scared about when it comes to remakes, especially with a game like Ocarina of Time. And to me personally, I think a lot of people also don't understand what a remake essentially is. A lot of people think a remake should be a one-to-one. That is it. But there's so much difficulty creating a one-to-one remake, because in order to make a one-to-one remake, that means you have to keep everything in place. And some stuff will not fit well in continuity, or just won't fit into how we consume modern gaming today and how game developers make modern gaming. It was fine back then, but I feel like there is a struggle with it. And this is just literally my own personal opinion on that. Everyone else might be slightly different in regards to it. But I do think it's hard to just make a one-to-one remake. I think it's very difficult, and I never really expect a remake to ever be one-to-one at all. So I do think, personally, that Nintendo will make changes to Ocarina of Time. But they won't be so drastic to the point where it's just a completely different story. I think they will hit every story beat perfectly. I do think they will add new things that keep the story flowing better. Yes, Ocarina of Time had such great pacing, but that doesn't mean that they can't do that with new additions. Sometimes that may lead to subtractions as well. But I think the only time they will ever do any sort of subtractions is, there's a lot of really darker things in Ocarina of Time, such as the well, the Shadow Temple, even some of the enemies like the Re-Dead and even Dead Hand. Dead Hand is one of the scariest goddamn things I ever experienced in video games when I played Ocarina of Time for the first time. Like, holy crap, that thing scared the living hell out of me. And you can't avoid them. You needed to beat them in order to get two important items to get through the Shadow Temple and the well. So, those motherfuckers are scary as hell, and it traumatized a lot of people. But there's a lot of darker themes in Ocarina of Time, and it's considered one of the darker games. While I do think Majora's Mask is a little bit darker just because of the theme of Majora's Mask, there's a lot of dark things, and then when you really go beyond just what you see in the game, there's a lot of darker themes that occur, especially with Link. And he's like considered one. This Link in Ocarina of Time is considered one of the most tragic Links of any of them, because of so much shit that goes on in his life. He basically skips his entire childhood. Most of the endings he does get is just sad, and he gets thrust this responsibility on him that just is just so hard for anyone, especially a kid who suddenly has to, live in a body of an adult or a young teen, whatever. So there's a lot of dark themes, and I do think some of that stuff will be toned down. I do think that's going to be most of the subtractions that they will do with Ocarina of Time. But I do think they will have more additions, because there's certain stuff that they definitely didn't have in the original game that we kind of as fans wish to see. For example, when you leave the Lost Woods, Saria gives you a Ocarina. Then later on in the game, you suddenly switch that Ocarina into the Ocarina of Time. And we don't know exactly what happens to Saria's Ocarina. I know this may not be an interesting thing to some people, but it is curious, because as part of the tragedy, you could have that Ocarina that he got from one of his best friends, the only person in Kokiri Village that really cared about Link, and seeing maybe something like Ganondorf taking the Ocarina and then crushing it, thinking it's the Ocarina of Time. That's something that happened in the Ocarina of Time manga. So there's so many things that we could see, some new additions that could be so vital to improving the lore. And that's what remakes are. Remakes are taking a game, an old game, taking that story, remaking it from the ground up with the newest technology that is currently available, and adding more things to it. Sometimes subtracting things, but that's fine. As long as the new additions improve the lore, give us more things that we always want to know about the video game that they're remaking. And I think Ocarina of Time is a good game that deserves a lot more lore update. And I think this is the perfect time to do so, and I think Nintendo has many ideas that they once thought about Ocarina of Time that they are now able to do. I know there's one thing that people are saying that is a lore change, specifically from the trailer, where young Link has the Triforce appearing. But again, that could be something that could literally be just for the trailer, as like, oh, this is fate, this is Link, he's gonna have the Triforce of Courage, That could literally just be a trailer. That could literally not be anything that they're doing that would change the lore whatsoever. And I get it. That fear, because of remakes like Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil 2 and even Resident Evil 3, one of the worst remakes I ever played. There's some good. It's still a good game. It's just not a good remake, and people are scared of that. People don't want those changes. People don't want Ocarina of Time to change, and Ocarina of Time is one of those games that is so beloved by the gaming community that any sort of big major change will be like Armageddon to that fan base, to those fans. And I get that. I don't see Nintendo doing a complete one-to-one remake. Also, I do not see them doing it in 3 parts like Final Fantasy VII is doing. But that's mostly because Ocarina of Time is not really that long of a game that you need 3 parts. Final Fantasy VII is a pretty long game. But I do think they could fit everything from the original game, but also add new things that also just improve the lore. Maybe give us more character depth. Something that Final Fantasy VII did really well with Jessie, Wedge, and Biggs. So you have that opportunity to show us more character depth with a lot of characters that we saw in the original. Maybe we see more character depth with Malin, and her family and her ranch and stuff like that. So that's why I think we shouldn't be afraid of remakes adding new things. Because adding new things can improve the lore and improve the story very well, especially the characters. And while yes, I do agree that some remakes have done some injustice to old games that is very beloved in the communities, but I wouldn't be afraid, because at the end of the day, remakes do give the opportunity to enhance and improve the story of the old game. Because that's what remakes are at the end of the day. They improve the story, they are built from the ground up. They take the story, take the normal story beats, and they just add new things to it to give us a new experience. That's why remakes have two specific people they target: newcomers and the old fans. Newcomers will get to experience the story that they've always wondered why it's one of the greatest games of all time. And the old heads who love Ocarina of Time, guess what? You will experience Ocarina of Time again, but in a different aspect of it. And that's what makes remakes great. That's why some remakes are really good, because they do that so freaking well. And I understand there will be people who will be highly upset about it. I get that. At the end of the day, they're still going to make remakes. They're not going to stop, because, again, this is a video game company. These are companies that are looking for the next cash grab. You know, they're looking for, you know, the next big thing that they want to sell. And remakes are a hot commodity nowadays. So I understand the wariness of a remake for Ocarina of Time. Like I said, it's probably going to be the one remake I'm going to critique very harshly compared to any other remake I've played. But at the same time, I can't wait for it. I can't wait to see what they add, what new changes they do. Who knows, maybe we might get an actual Temple of Light. You know, before we get the Light Medallion, we actually get a Temple of Light that we get to explore. And then at the end of it, we not only get the Light Medallion, but we get to see the pedestal. And that's where the Master Sword is. Because there was an original concept for it. That's what I mean when I say remakes are great, because we get to see more content. Like the Temple of Light could be an actual thing that we get to actually do. And I get it. You want to preserve the original game and everything that you loved about it. But I'm someone, and this is just a me thing, I'm someone who loves new additions to the lore and seeing that new additions come to fruition because they couldn't do it back then. I get it. If you don't like that, that's your preference, and that's fine. I just think that we shouldn't give remakes such a bad rep unless they completely butcher it. But most remakes that we've seen haven't really butchered it that much. I get this, you know, so much hate on Resident Evil 3 Remake, and I'm one of the people who don't like the game. And there's a lot of hate for Final Fantasy VII because, and this is my own personal opinion on that, no one really knows how it's going to end, and that's where a lot of people are frustrated because they wanted a one-to-one remake, and now they think it's completely different and not exactly one-to-one. But I don't think any of that will happen with Ocarina of Time. I do think Ocarina of Time will be as close to a one-to-one remake, you know, just compared to Link's Awakening. That was a pretty much very close to a one-to-one remake. And with new additions, I think it's just going to make the game a lot more lore content heavier, and I think it will and still will be regarded as one of the greatest games of all time. I just don't see any way Nintendo really messing this up at all. I know people will probably be upset more so for the toning down certain things, but at the end of the day, the original will always be available on the Nintendo Switch Online or wherever you want to get it. You do you in that regard. But yeah, I just wouldn't worry too much. And I think at the end of the day, regardless of how it is and how you feel about it, it will be okay. It will be perfectly okay. Because you can always go back to the original to play it. That's just how it is. And I get it. I get it specifically from Resident Evil fans because they don't like how Capcom said that the remakes are their focus and they don't really give a damn about the OG games. And that really made people angry. I get that. And some may feel that way about Ocarina of Time. I just wouldn't worry. I just would not worry because I trust Nintendo, not in a lot of things, but I do trust in like their craft and their experience and how much they care about certain games. And this is definitely one of the games they definitely care a lot about. So let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time, okay? Bye bye, everyone.